What if I told you that toilet paper in the Middle Ages was a handful of hay, and your daily outfit was the same itchy wool tunic you'd wear until it literally rotted off your body? Medieval hygiene wasn't just bad. It was an active assault on your senses. Tonight, we're exploring the grim realities of staying clean in an era where even castles dumped their waste into the moat. Your day began before dawn with the sound of livestock shuffling next to your bed. That's right, you didn't get a bedroom. You slept alongside your family, servants, and often the animals in a single smoky room. Your mattress was a sack stuffed with straw, crawling with fleas and lice that had been breeding there for years. No flipping it over for the clean side. This was your life now. Privacy didn't exist. You dressed, undressed, and relieved yourself in front of everyone. The concept of personal space was a luxury for nobility, and even then, a thin curtain was the height of discretion. If you were lucky, your home had a separate building for livestock, but most peasants shared their living space with goats, chickens, or pigs. The smell of manure mixed with sweat and damp wool never left your nose. Your body ached every morning. With no proper support from your mattress, chronic back pain was standard. Arthritis set in early from manual labor and constant exposure to damp conditions. There was no stretching routine or ergonomic pillow, just the grim acceptance that your joints would creak like an old wagon wheel by age 30. Hygiene, forget it. You didn't wash your face or brush your teeth. Water was too precious to waste on cleaning, and soap was a coarse, greasy block made from animal fat and ashes. If you splashed cold water on your face at all, it was likely from the same trough the animals drank from. Morning breath wasn't a temporary problem. It was your default state. Breakfast wasn't a leisurely meal. You grabbed whatever leftovers hadn't molded from last night's pottage, a thick grey gruel of boiled grains and vegetables. If you were wealthy enough to own a cow, you might get a splash of sour milk. Otherwise, it was stale bread so hard you'd risk cracking a tooth. Clothing was another joy. You owned one set of wool garments worn year-round, never washed, and patched until they disintegrated. Lice nested in the seams, and fungal infections thrived in the damp fabric. Changing clothes wasn't an option. This was it, until the garment literally fell apart. By the time you stepped outside, your body already hurt, your skin itched, and your stomach growled. But the day was just starting. There were fields to plough, animals to tend, and a lord demanding his share of your crop. No sick days, no weekends, just sunlight to sundown labour until you dropped. The modern world complains about early alarms, but at least we wake up in clean beds, with indoor plumbing and coffee waiting. Medieval mornings were a brutal reminder that comfort is a very recent invention. And if you think this was bad, wait until you hear about their bathroom situation. The medieval toilet experience was a communal nightmare. Public latrines were long benches with holes cut into them, where people sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers while doing their business. Privacy wasn't a concern. These were social spaces where conversations continued as if you weren't actively relieving yourself in front of half the village. The stench alone could knock you out, with ammonia fumes so strong they burned your eyes. Most peasants didn't even have access to latrines. Their bathroom was a wooden bucket kept in the corner of their one-room home. At night, you'd use it in darkness, trying not to wake the whole family with the sound. Come morning, you'd haul it outside and dump the contents into the street. Everyone did this, which meant the pathways between houses were rivers of human waste mixed with animal manure and rotting food scraps. When it rained, the streets turned into a foul soup that soaked into your shoes. Nobles and castles had slightly better arrangements, but not by much. Their garderobes were small rooms with holes that emptied directly into the moat. Imagine being a guard stationed below, hearing splashes as waste rained down into the water you were supposed to defend. The moats around castles weren't just defensive barriers. They were open sewers breeding disease. Some sieges actually failed because attackers couldn't stomach the smell coming from the overflowing waste chutes. Toilet paper didn't exist. You used whatever was at hand: straw, leaves, moss, or scraps of old cloth if you were wealthy enough to waste fabric. Some people just used their hand and hoped they could find water to rinse off later. There was no soap, so washing up meant a quick splash from a dirty bucket. Keeping your hands clean wasn't a priority. When everyone lived in filth, there wasn't much point trying to stay spotless. The streets were so hazardous with waste that some towns had a law requiring people to shout "Gardez-le" before dumping their chamber pots out the window. It didn't always work. Walking through town meant navigating a minefield of human excrement while keeping an ear out for sudden shouts from above. One wrong step and you'd slip on a wet stone, tumbling face first into humanity's leftovers. Disease was inevitable. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera thrived in the unsanitary conditions. Even minor cuts could kill you if they became infected, which happened often when every surface was coated in bacteria. People didn't understand germ theory, so they blamed illnesses on bad air or divine punishment. The truth was much simpler. They were literally living in their own filth. Contrast this with modern bathrooms. Flushing toilets, running water, and actual toilet paper feel like miracles when you consider what came before. Medieval people would have killed for a single roll of 2-ply. Even public restrooms today, as unpleasant as they can be, are palaces compared to the shared bench latrines of the Middle Ages. The smell alone would break a modern person. There was no escaping it. The stench of waste clung to everything. Clothes, hair, the inside of your nose. You'd get used to it over time. But visitors from other towns would gag when they arrived. Some cities were so infamous for their odor that travelers would hold scented cloths to their faces as they approached. Personal hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was actively discouraged. Doctors believed bathing opened your pores, allowing diseases to enter your body. Most people washed maybe once a month, if that. The wealthy might relax in wooden tubs a few times a year, but peasants went months or even years without proper cleaning. Fleas, lice, and mites were constant companions, burrowing into skin and hair. Next time you complain about a public restroom, remember, at least it has a door. At least you don't have to make small talk with strangers while using it. At least you aren't dumping waste into the street where your neighbors walk. Modern sanitation is something we take for granted, but medieval people lived in conditions that would violate every health code today. Surprisingly, the food situation might have been worse. At least with waste, you knew it was bad. With medieval meals, you often didn't realize how dangerous they were until it was too late. Your morning meal in medieval times was a bowl of pottage, a thick grey gruel that simmered in the same pot for weeks. Each day, someone tossed in whatever scraps were available: a handful of barley, a few wilted greens, maybe some beans if the harvest was decent. There was no recipe. The pot never emptied completely, just got topped up with whatever wouldn't kill you immediately. The flavor. Imagine wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. Your bread wasn't much better. Made from coarse rye or barley, it was so dense it could deflect arrows. Slicing wasn't an option. You had to gnaw at it like an animal or soak it in your pottage until it softened enough to chew. During bad harvests, bakers bogged it out with sawdust, ground acorns, or even clay to make it stretch further. If you were really unlucky, ergot fungus infected the rye, turning your breakfast into a potential death sentence. One meal could leave you convulsing or hallucinating before it killed you. The drink with your meal, beer. Even children drank it. Water was so contaminated with parasites and waste that beer was the safer option. It was weak, barely alcoholic, but the brewing process killed some of the worst bacteria. Wine existed, but only the rich could afford it. For peasants, every meal came with a side of low-grade beer, warm and flat, just to avoid dysentery. Meat was a luxury you might see once a week, if the local lord allowed it. Deer, boar, and other game animals belonged to the nobility, and poaching meant fines, imprisonment, or worse. When you did get meat, it wasn't fresh. Without refrigeration, it hung for days, gathering flies and developing a ripe aroma before being tossed into a pot. Fish was slightly more common near coasts, but it was often salted to the point of being inedible. Dairy spoiled quickly, so cheese and butter were packed with bacteria. A slice of moldy bread with cheese wasn't a delicacy. It was just your only option. Vegetables were seasonal and bland. Turnips, onions, and cabbages boiled to mush were the staples. Spices like pepper cost more than a month's wages, so flavoring was non-existent. Herbs grew wild, but most people didn't know how to use them. Your entire diet was variations on the same mushy, unseasoned slop, day after day. Malnutrition was inevitable. Scurvy, rickets, and other deficiencies warped bodies and rotted teeth. Preservation methods were primitive. Smoking, salting, and fermenting were the only ways to keep food from spoiling, if you could call it keeping. Meat sat in barrels of brine until it was leathery and foul. Fish dried into rock-hard slabs that had to be soaked for hours before eating. Bread mold was scraped off until the loaf crumbled. There was no expiration date. You ate it until it made you sick, or until it ran out. Famine was a constant threat. A bad harvest meant starvation. Lords still demanded their share of crops, leaving peasants with nothing. People ate bark, grass, and boiled leather to survive. Stories tell of desperate villagers grinding bones into flour or digging up rotting carcasses. Cannibalism wasn't unheard of in the worst winters. Even in good years, food was scarce. You were always one season away from disaster. Compare that to a modern breakfast. Fresh fruit, crisp bacon, eggs cooked to order. A fridge stocked with perishables that stay edible for weeks. Coffee brewed from beans grown halfway across the world. Medieval peasants would have murdered for a single orange or a cup of clean water. The worst part? You never knew if your food was safe. One bite of moldy bread could mean vomiting for days. A sip from the wrong well left you writhing with parasites. Every meal was a gamble, and the house always won eventually. Clothing didn't offer much comfort either. That itchy wool tunic you wore. It was the only one you'd ever own. Your entire wardrobe consisted of one scratchy wool tunic or linen shift. You wore it every day, in every season, until it literally fell apart. There were no spare outfits, no seasonal changes, just the same stiff, sweat-soaked garment month after month. The wool itched constantly, rubbing your skin raw in places. Linen was slightly better in summer, but turned into a damp, clinging mess when it rained. Either way, you couldn't escape the discomfort. Underwear didn't exist for most peasants. If you were lucky, you might have a thin linen undertunic, but most people went commando beneath their outer clothes. The rough wool scraped directly against your skin, chafing your thighs and waist. Sweat soaked into the fabric, creating a perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas. You scratched constantly, but the pests never left. They nested in the seams, laying eggs that hatched into more biting, crawling annoyances. Washing your clothes was nearly impossible. Soap was expensive, and water had to be hauled from a well or river. Even if you managed to scrub your tunic, drying it took days in damp weather. Most people just wore their clothes until the stench became unbearable. The fabric stiffened with dirt and sweat, smelling like a mix of old cheese and wet dog. You got used to the odor, but visitors would wrinkle their noses when they got close. Fungal infections were inevitable. The constant dampness, lack of ventilation, and unwashed fabric led to rashes, sores, and peeling skin. Your feet were the worst. If you had shoes at all, they were crude leather sacks that trapped moisture. Going barefoot meant stepping in mud, dung, and whatever else littered the ground. Cuts became infected quickly, turning into oozing ulcers that never fully healed. Your toenails thickened and yellowed from repeated fungal assaults. Mending was a constant chore. Clothes weren't replaced until they disintegrated, so you patched holes with whatever scraps you could find. A frayed hem might be fixed with a strip of old sackcloth, secured with clumsy stitches. The repairs itched just as much as the original fabric, but you had no choice. A new tunic cost more than you could afford, so you made do with what you had. Nobility had it slightly better, but not by much. Even wealthy lords wore the same outfit for days at a time. Their clothes were finer wool or silk, but they still attracted lice and fleas. The rich could afford to change their undergarments more often, but outer layers went unwashed for weeks. Perfume helped mask the smell, but it just mixed with body odor to create a new kind of assault on the nose. Footwear was a luxury. Many peasants went barefoot year-round, even in winter. If you had shoes, they were simple leather wraps held together with straps. There was no arch support, no cushioning, just a thin layer between your feet and the rocky ground. Walking long distances left your soles cracked and bleeding. In wet weather, the leather soaked through, squishing with every step. The social implications were harsh. Your clothing marked your place in society instantly. Peasants wore drab patched tunics, while merchants might afford a slightly better cut. Nobles flaunted colourful fabrics, but even they rarely changed outfits more than once a week. You couldn't hide your poverty. Your stained, threadbare clothes announced it to everyone you met. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothes, with the same lack of comfort. Their tunics itched just as much, and they suffered the same fungal infections. Babies were wrapped in rough swaddling cloths, often handed down through multiple siblings. Diapers didn't exist, so infants soiled their wrappings constantly. Parents rinsed the cloths when they could, but the smell never really left. Winter was brutal. Your single tunic offered little protection against the cold. You layered whatever rags you could find underneath, but the wind still cut through. Frostbite was common, especially in fingers and toes. If you were lucky, you had a rough cloak or blanket to huddle under at night. Most peasants slept in their clothes, adding months of sweat and grime to the fabric. Compare this to modern closets full of clean, soft fabrics. We throw clothes in a machine and have them washed in an hour. We own multiple outfits for different occasions, with shoes designed for comfort. Medieval people would have marveled at the idea of throwing away a shirt just because it had a hole. The health consequences were severe. Open sores from chafing became infected. Lice carried diseases like typhus. Fungal infections spread unchecked. Your clothing wasn't just uncomfortable, it was actively making you sick. Yet there was no alternative. You endured the itching, the smell, and the infections because you had no other choice. Next time you complain about laundry day, remember, at least you're not wearing the same stiff, lice-ridden tunic you've had for 3 years. At least your shoes don't squish with every step. At least you can change into clean clothes at the end of the day. Modern clothing is a luxury medieval peasants couldn't even imagine. But if you think that's bad, wait until you hear about their dental hygiene, or complete lack of it. By 25, your teeth would be rotting stumps, and the cures were worse than the pain. By the time you hit 25 in medieval Europe, your smile looked like a row of crumbling tombstones. Toothbrushes didn't exist. Toothpaste was centuries away. Your idea of dental care was rubbing your teeth with a dirty finger or chewing on a twig if you were feeling fancy. The result? Teeth stained black with decay, gums swollen with infection, and breath that could knock out a horse. Cavities weren't just common, they were inevitable. That gritty bread you ate every day wore down your enamel. Fermented grains in your beer and porridge created acid that ate holes in your teeth. Food packed into every crevice, rotting slowly since you couldn't properly clean it out. Your molars turned black and soft, crumbling when you bit down. The pain became a constant companion, throbbing with every meal. Gum disease was universal. Your gums bled when you chewed. Pus pockets formed around tooth roots. The stench of infection mixed with the ever-present bad breath from rotting food particles. There were no dentists to scrape away plaque, just barbers who occasionally moonlighted as tooth pullers. They knew nothing about gum health, so infection spread unchecked through your jawbone. Toothaches drove people to madness. The pain could last for months, sharp spikes radiating through your skull with every heartbeat. Some tried numbing it with alcohol or herbal poultices, but nothing worked for long. Desperate sufferers would grab pliers and attempt DIY extractions. Others prayed to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of tooth problems. But her miracles were in short supply. When you finally went for an extraction, it was a horror show. Barber surgeons used iron hooks to yank teeth by candlelight. No anesthesia, no sterile tools. They'd brace a knee against your chest for leverage while pulling. If the tooth broke, they'd dig out the roots with sharp probes. The risk of infection was high. Sepsis from a toothache killed more people than you'd think. The wealthy had worse teeth than peasants in some ways. Sugar was a status symbol for nobles, who ate it until their teeth turned black and rotted from the inside out. Queen Elizabeth I was famous for her sweet tooth, and equally famous for her mouth full of decaying stumps. Peasants at least avoided sugar, but their coarse diet still destroyed their teeth slowly. Bad breath was inescapable. With no way to clean your tongue or between teeth, your mouth bred bacteria constantly. The stench hit people before you even spoke. Kissing was an act of bravery. Some tried chewing mint or parsley to mask it, but nothing could overcome years of built-up rot. You just accepted that everyone's breath smelled like a sewer. Missing teeth changed your face. Without modern dentistry, gaps never got filled. Your cheeks sank inward where teeth were gone. Surviving teeth shifted crookedly into empty spaces. By 40, you might have only a few yellowed fangs left, making chewing nearly impossible. Many medieval skeletons show signs of malnutrition from people who couldn't properly eat in their later years. Dental infections killed more often than you'd expect. An abscess could swell your jaw shut, then spread infection to your brain or bloodstream. Fever would set in, followed by delirium and death. Some historians believe King Louis IX of France died from a dental infection that reached his brain. There were no antibiotics, just hope and prayer against the spreading infection. Oddly, some medieval people had better teeth than others depending on location. Skeletons from coastal areas often show less decay, likely from seafood diets rich in vitamin D. Inland peasants eating grain-heavy diets had worse dental health, but nowhere was safe from the universal truth. By adulthood, your mouth was a disaster zone. The rich tried cosmetic fixes that made things worse. They'd rub teeth with abrasive powders to whiten them, which just wore down enamel faster. Some used urine as a mouthwash, believing it strengthened gums. Others had black teeth intentionally to show off their sugar consumption. Rotted teeth became a status symbol among the elite. Children's teeth fared no better. Without proper nutrition, their adult teeth grew in crooked and weak. Many medieval children had cavities in their baby teeth that infected the permanent ones underneath. By 12, they already had the dental problems of a modern 50-year-old. The cycle started early and never let up. Tooth pain affected every part of life. It made sleeping difficult. It ruined meals. Chronic pain shortened tempers and made people miserable. Some historical records show people begging for death during particularly bad toothaches. The constant background misery of dental problems wore people down year after year. Compare this to modern dentistry. Cleanings every 6 months. Fillings done with precision tools. Root canals that save infected teeth. Medieval people would have traded a year's wages for a single tube of toothpaste or a pro. Precision tools. Root canals that save infected teeth. Medieval people would have traded a year's wages for a single tube of toothpaste or a proper dental drill. The pain they endured daily is unimaginable now. The next time you dread a dentist visit, remember, at least they use anesthesia. At least the tools are sterilized. At least you won't have a barber kneeling on your chest while yanking with rusty pliers. Modern dental care is a miracle medieval people never got to experience. But teeth were just one of many bodily betrayals. Your hands were next in line for destruction, thanks to the brutal labor demanded of you from sunrise to sunset. Your workday began before sunrise and ended long after dark. There were no contracts, no lunch breaks, no weekends. From childhood until death, your body belonged to the Lord who owned the land you worked. The deal was simple. You farmed his fields, harvested his crops, and in return, he let you keep just enough to survive. Everything else went to fill his storehouses. The tools you used were barely more advanced than those from the Stone Age. A wooden plough with an iron tip that barely scratched the soil. A rusty sickle that tore at grain stalks instead of cutting cleanly. A wooden pitchfork with splinters that worked their way deep into your palms. Even simple tasks took twice as long with these crude instruments. Your muscles screaming by mid-morning from the inefficiency. Every season brought its own special misery. In spring, you ploughed fields with your back bent double, hands cracking open from gripping the plough. Summer meant weeding under a scorching sun, picking off ticks that crawled up your legs from the brush. Autumn was harvest time, back-breaking weeks of cutting, threshing, and bundling grain until your hands bled. Winter offered no rest either. There were fences to mend, firewood to chop, animals to tend in freezing barns. Women worked just as hard as men, often harder. After a full day in the fields, they returned home to tend children, cook meals, spin wool, and clean. There was no division of labor, just endless chores stacking up until you collapsed into your filthy straw bed each night. Many women worked right up until childbirth, then returned to the fields days later with infants strapped to their backs. Children started working as soon as they could walk. At 5 years old, they herded geese or gathered firewood. By 8, they were out in the fields pulling weeds or scaring birds away from crops. Education was non-existent. Every able body had to contribute, or the family wouldn't eat through winter. Most peasant children never learned to read or write. Their hands were too busy with hoes and scythes to hold a quill. Specialized trades offered no escape. Blacksmiths breathed in toxic fumes from burning coal all day. Tanners soaked hides in human urine and dog feces to process leather. The stench clung to them permanently. Bakers worked in sweltering heat near open flames, their arms covered in burns from pulling loaves out of stone ovens. Every job destroyed your body in its own way. The Lord controlled every aspect of your work life. He decided when you planted and harvested. He took most of what you produced as taxes. His bailiffs supervised your labor, whipping anyone who worked too slowly. If you tried to leave, his men would hunt you down and drag you back. Escaping your feudal obligations was practically impossible. There were no sick days. If you woke up with fever shakes, you still had to work or face punishment. Broken bones had to heal while you kept laboring. Pregnant women worked until they went into labor in the fields. Old people labored until they literally dropped dead, their corpses hauled away so others could keep working. Pay didn't exist in any meaningful sense. You might get a few coins at harvest time, but most compensation came as loaves of bread or portions of the grain you'd harvested yourself. Essentially, you were paid with small amounts of the same crops you'd spent months growing. After the Lord took his massive share first, the physical toll was devastating. By 30, most peasants had the bodies of modern 60-year-olds, scoliosis from constant bending, arthritis from damp conditions, hernias from lifting heavy loads, missing fingers from farming accidents, bad backs from carrying water buckets over rough terrain. Your body was permanently damaged goods by middle age. Sleep offered little recovery. You collapsed exhausted onto your straw mattress each night, only to repeat the same punishing routine at dawn. There was no time for leisure, no energy for hobbies. Survival demanded every waking moment of your existence. Creativity and joy were luxuries you couldn't afford. The seasons cycled endlessly with no improvement in your situation. Each year began with hope and ended in resignation. Your children entered the same system you'd suffered through, their futures as bleak as yours. Generation after generation lived and died in this slow-motion nightmare of perpetual labor. Compare this to modern workplaces with their chairs and coffee breaks and safety regulations. Medieval peasants would have laughed bitterly at the concept of a minimum wage or overtime pay. The idea of suing an employer for unsafe conditions would have gotten you hanged as a troublemaker. Contemporary complaints about long commutes would sound absurd. To someone who slept in the barn where they worked, your entire existence served one purpose: making the Lord richer. He lived in a stone castle with tapestries, while you shivered in a mud hut. He feasted on roast meats while you choked down gruel. He wore fine wool while your single tunic disintegrated on your back. The system was designed to keep you exhausted and powerless, too busy surviving to question its injustice. Even death brought no escape from exploitation. Your children inherited your debts and obligations. The land you'd worked all your life would never belong to your family. Everything you'd bled for would pass seamlessly to the next generation of starving laborers. Your gravestone, if you got one, would be an unmarked rock in a field you'd never owned. The constant stress shortened lifespans dramatically. Between accidents, malnutrition, and sheer exhaustion, most peasants died before seeing 45. The few who survived to old age became bent, toothless, half-blind shadows of people, their bodies destroyed by decades of abuse. There were no retirement homes, just a corner of your child's hut where you'd wait to die. No wonder peasant revolts sometimes erupted despite suicidal odds. The desperation of working yourself to death for nothing occasionally overcame the fear of brutal retaliation. Most uprisings failed spectacularly, their leaders tortured publicly as warnings. But the anger remained, simmering beneath layers of exhaustion and hopelessness. Workplace safety didn't exist. If a plowshare sliced your foot open, you'd likely die slowly from infection. If grain dust damaged your lungs after years of threshing, you'd just cough yourself to death. Hundreds of mundane hazards could kill you simply because no one cared enough to prevent them. The psychological toll was as bad as the physical. You knew your life would never improve. Your children were doomed to the same misery. Escape was nearly impossible. Each morning, you woke up to infinite drudgery stretching before you until the grave. No wonder alcoholism was rampant. Small beer was the only available relief from crushing reality. Nobody romanticized labor back then. There were no cute depictions of happy peasants dancing in fields. Medieval art showed workers as bent, miserable creatures, because that's what they were. The noble ideal of chivalry completely ignored the exploited masses who made knightly lifestyles possible. Today's complaints about work pale in comparison. We have weekends, workers' comp, and the ability to quit. Even the worst modern jobs offer more dignity than the medieval peasant's endless servitude. The next time you dread Monday morning, remember, at least no one can legally whip you for being late. At least you won't die because your employer won't allow sick days. At least your labor actually earns you money instead of scraps. Weather was another relentless enemy. Whether scorching heat or freezing cold, you had no protection from the elements, just the same thin tunic and bare feet through all seasons. Your medieval home didn't keep out weather. It barely slowed it down. The walls were wooden planks with gaps so wide you could toss a chicken through them. Windows had no glass, just thin cloth flaps that let in every gust of wind. The thatched roof leaked when it rained, and drafts whistled through cracks year-round. You might as well have been living outside. Winter was a slow torture. You bundled up in your one damp wool tunic, huddling near the feeble hearth, where a few embers struggled to stay alive. The fire couldn't get too big. Firewood was expensive, and you needed to save it for cooking. At night, you slept in a pile of family members just to share body heat. Even so, you'd wake with your nose frozen, your toes numb, and a layer of frost on your blanket. The cold seeped into your joints, making your arthritis flare up. Every cough threatened to turn into pneumonia. Summer wasn't any better. Your home became a clay oven. The thick walls trapped heat like a bread kiln. With no fans or cross breezes, the air grew thick and foul. Sweat soaked through your layers, but you couldn't strip down. Showing too much skin was scandalous, and besides, it left you open to sunburn and insect bites. Flies swarmed through the open windows, drawn by the smell of unwashed bodies and spoiled food. At night, the heat lingered, making sleep nearly impossible. Rain turned your home into a swamp. Water dripped through the roof into strategic puddles you'd learned to avoid. Dampness made your clothes mildew and your straw mattress rot. Humidity clung to your skin, mixing with sweat and grime. Mud oozed under the door, tracked in by livestock and family members until the packed earth floor became a slurry. The constant moisture bred mold that made you cough, and your shoes never fully dried. Spring and autumn offered no relief either. Chilly mornings gave way to sweltering afternoons, so you were either shivering or sweating all day. Sudden storms left you drenched with no way to get dry. Wind ripped through your home, scattering ashes from the hearth and blowing out your precious candles. There was no adapting, just enduring whatever the sky decided to throw at you. Nobles didn't have it much better. Their stone castles were damp and drafty, with thick walls that never warmed up. Servants carried heated stones to warm beds, but the chill always won. In summer, the stones radiated trapped heat, making the nobles sweat just like the peasants. At least they could afford fur cloaks. But even those got moldy in the damp. Health suffered constantly from exposure. Colds turned into bronchitis. Dampness led to rheumatic fever. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes in winter, while dehydration and heat stroke struck in summer. You coughed year-round from breathing in smoke and mold. Children suffered most, weak from malnutrition. They died quickly from fevers that modern kids shake off in days. Clothing offered no real protection. Your wool tunic soaked up rain like a sponge and took days to dry. In winter, layers of filthy, sweat-stiffened cloth rubbed your skin raw. In summer, the same layers cooked you alive. Shoes were thin leather sacks that let in water and dirt. You went barefoot when you could, but that left your feet cracked and bleeding from rough ground. Bedtime was just another battle. Your mattress was a sack of scratchy straw crawling with fleas. Blankets were thin wool scraps that barely trapped heat. In winter, you piled everyone together for warmth, meaning you slept in a tangle of snoring, farting relatives. In summer, the heat and insects made sleep impossible. You might get 4 or 5 hours on a good night before the roosters woke you for another brutal day. Fire was a constant danger. Thatched roofs burned easily, and a stray spark could doom your entire home. People died in house fires all the time, especially in winter when hearths burned non-stop. You couldn't escape outside either. If your home burned, you'd freeze to death in minutes without shelter. Whole villages sometimes vanished overnight in accidental blazes. Storms terrified you for good reason. Lightning could set your roof on fire. Hail destroyed crops in minutes. Heavy snow collapsed poorly built homes. There were no weather forecasts, so you never knew when disaster might strike. After particularly bad storms, you'd find dead livestock scattered across fields, frozen or drowned where they fell. The rich tried to cope with tapestries and rugs, but these just trapped dampness and insects. Some castles had garderobes, toilet chutes that emptied outside, but the stench still wafted back in through cracks. Nobles burned fragrant herbs to mask odors, but nothing could fully cover the reek of unwashed bodies and mildew. Seasonal work didn't stop for weather. You plowed fields in freezing rain, planted seeds with numb fingers, and harvested crops under a blistering sun. Animals needed feeding no matter how hard the wind howled. Water had to be hauled from frozen over streams in winter. There were no snow days, no heat advisories, just relentless labor in whatever conditions nature threw at you. Modern homes seem like miracles by comparison. Central heating warms every room evenly. Air conditioning keeps summer heat at bay. Insulated walls block drafts, and double-pane windows keep out noise and cold. We complain about high utility bills, while medieval people would have traded a year's earnings for one electric blanket. The daily struggle against weather wore people down. You were always too hot, too cold, or too wet. There was no relief, no comfortable place to rest. Every season brought fresh miseries, and you aged quickly from constant exposure. Modern weather forecasts and climate-controlled homes have erased this level of suffering. We forget how much effort it once took just to stay alive through a single winter. With weather already trying to kill you, water posed another constant threat. And it wasn't just the lack of clean drinking water that made life miserable. Even basic hygiene was considered dangerous, as most people believed washing too often could make you sick. You'd think drinking water would be safe. You'd be wrong. That clear-looking stream carried more death than a battlefield. Upstream, someone dumped their chamber pot. A dead dog floated around the bend. Dirt and parasites swirled in every sip. Water wasn't life-giving. It was Russian roulette with your intestines. That's why everyone drank beer, even kids. The brewing process killed some bacteria, making weak ales safer than any water source. You started the day with beer, drank it with meals, and finished with more beer. Hydration meant permanent low-grade intoxication. Bathing was considered dangerous. Doctors believed water opened your pores, letting diseases in. A layer of dirt was thought to protect you, so people went months without washing. When they finally cleaned themselves, it was with water from the same filthy rivers. The rich sometimes used perfumes to mask their stench, but that just mixed flower scents with months of sweat. The result smelled like roses rotting in a latrine. Communal bathhouses existed, but the church shut most down. They'd become meeting spots for prostitutes and political plotters. Even without the crackdown, bathing was hard work. You needed to haul and heat water, then scrub yourself in a leaky wooden tub. Most people skipped the hassle. They'd rub themselves with dry cloths instead, smearing dirt around rather than removing it. The cleanest people often had thick layers of grime polished smooth from years of friction. Rainwater wasn't safer. People collected it in open barrels where mosquitoes bred and birds defecated. You'd scoop out a cup only to find dead insects floating in it. Boiling water helped, but fuel was expensive. Why waste firewood cleaning water when you could brew beer instead? The choice was simple. Drink questionable ale or risk dysentery's violent demise. Most chose the ale. Waterborne diseases killed constantly. Dysentery made you bleed from your bowels until you dehydrated to death. Typhoid brought fevers so high they cooked your brain. Cholera emptied your body through both ends until your heart stopped. There were no rehydration salts or IV drips, just a bed to die in while your family prayed. These weren't rare tragedies. They happened so often that parents had more children just to account for expected losses. Even hand washing was rare. You ate meals with dirt-caked fingers after working fields all day. Food particles rotted between your teeth, while fecal bacteria from unwashed hands spread to everything you touched. Surgeons operated with filthy hands, making infections guaranteed. Midwives delivered babies while coated in other patients' blood. Simple wounds often turned fatal as grime sealed inside became septic. Washing clothes was nearly as bad. Without detergents, clothes were beaten against rocks in dirty rivers, then left to dry in the same contaminated air. The result was stiff fabric that smelled like wet dog and still carried lice eggs. Some tried using lye soap made from ashes and fat, but it burned skin and left garments crunchy. Many just wore clothes until they disintegrated, the layers of sweat and dirt acting as accidental waterproofing. The wealthy had worse habits than peasants in some ways. Nobles believed bathing too often made them vulnerable, so they'd go weeks without washing. Their perfumes masked odors but couldn't hide the greasy film on their skin. Queen Isabella of Spain bragged about only bathing twice in her life, at birth and before her wedding. Her courtiers followed suit, their fancy clothes hiding bodies that crawled with lice. Children suffered most. Parents gave them beer because water was too dangerous, stunting growth with constant low-level alcohol. Infants drank breast milk from mothers who were half-drunk themselves. Toddlers played in dirt teeming with parasites, then ate without washing. Many kids died from simple diarrhea that modern medicine could cure with a $5 antibiotic pill. Those who survived grew up thinking constant stomach aches were normal. Well, water wasn't safe either. Most villages had one communal well, where waste slowly seeped underground. Even clear-looking water carried invisible threats. People would lower buckets on ropes that dragged through mud on their way up. You'd pull up your clean water, only to find a dead rat floating in it moments later. Still, you drank it. What choice did you have? Bathing became political. The church associated it with vanity or sin. Some priests claimed dirt demonstrated piety by rejecting worldly comforts. Kings gave up bathing during Lent to show devotion. The idea that cleanliness mattered wouldn't become common for centuries. Meanwhile, fleas thrived in people's underclothes, lice nested in unwashed hair, and skin infections spread through entire households. Doctors actually discouraged washing wounds. They thought pus showed the body healing, so they'd pack injuries with dung or dirt to draw out impurities. Surgeons took pride in filthy operating robes crusted with old blood, considering the stains proof of experience. Patients often died from infections introduced during treatment, but nobody understood why. The irony: some medieval people had better teeth than modern ones, because they rarely consumed sugar, but their breath could still kill a horse from yards away. Without toothbrushes or floss, food particles rotted between their teeth for decades. The combination of beer breath, rotting meat stuck in molars, and general body odor created a personal stench we can barely imagine today. Water shaped cities in awful ways. Towns sprung up near rivers for transportation and waste disposal. This meant drinking water came downstream from where all the sewage dumped in. London's Thames carried so much filth that during summer droughts, the stench made Parliament cancel sessions. Nobody connected the dots between this and disease outbreaks. They just held scented cloths to their noses and kept drinking. Modern water systems seem like magic by comparison. We turn a handle and get clean drinking water 24/7. Showers wash away grime in minutes with no hauling or heating. Washing machines sanitize clothes while we sleep. Medieval people would have thought these conveniences were witchcraft. Precisely controlled temperatures, perfect cleanliness, and no fear of dysentery from every sip. But if you think their approach to water was bad, wait until you hear about medieval medicine. The cures were often worse than the diseases. Think iron hooks for tooth extraction and leeches for headaches. Doctors didn't heal you so much as test how much pain you could endure before dying. In medieval Europe, your doctor was more likely to kill you than your disease. Medicine wasn't about healing. It was about surviving the cure. The foundation of all medical knowledge came from the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed keeping these in perfect balance kept you healthy. The problem: nobody could actually see these humours or measure them. Your treatment depended entirely on a physician's guess about which humour was out of whack. Bloodletting was the solution to almost everything. Got a fever? Time to drain some blood. Headache? More bloodletting. Feeling tired? Definitely needed less blood. Barber surgeons would slice open your arm with a dirty razor and let you bleed into a bowl. The ideal amount to remove was about a pint, but many kept going until patients fainted. This was considered a good sign. It meant the treatment was working. In reality, you were just passing out from blood loss. Surgeries happened while you were wide awake. No anesthesia, no painkillers, just a leather strap to bite down on while someone sawed at your leg. Tools weren't sterilized. They were just wiped on a dirty rag between patients. Bone saws, scalpels, and cautery irons passed through multiple bodies without cleaning. The heat they applied to tools wasn't for sterilization. It just made the metal look scarier. Infections were guaranteed, but nobody understood why people kept dying after operations. Got a stomachache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Medieval doctors blamed many illnesses on moral failings or demonic possession. Treatment involved prayer, vomiting, and sometimes exorcism. Physicians prescribed concoctions of ground-up animal parts, herbs, and occasionally literal dirt. One popular remedy for headaches was a poultice made from mashed earthworms. For the plague, some doctors recommended sitting in a sewer to balance the humours with foul air. Childbirth was a death sentence waiting to happen. Midwives had no concept of hygiene and would deliver babies with unwashed hands, still covered in another mother's blood. If complications arose, they might try to pull the baby out with hooks, often killing both mother and child. Postpartum infections killed about 1 in 3 mothers, thanks to the filthy conditions and complete lack of antibiotics. Dental work was especially horrific. Tooth extractions happened with tools that looked like something from a blacksmith's nightmare. The barber would yank your tooth, while an assistant held your head still. If the tooth broke, they'd dig out the roots with sharp metal picks. The pain was unimaginable, and infections afterward were almost guaranteed. Many people chose to live with rotting teeth, rather than face the torture of removal. The wealthy got even worse treatment than peasants. Royal physicians prescribed heroic medicines, extra-strength poisons meant to shock the body back to health. King Charles II's doctors gave him enemas containing antimony, a toxic metal, then made him swallow mercury. When that didn't work, they shaved his head and burned the skin with hot irons. He died 4 days later. Most noble patients would have survived if their doctors had just left them alone. Hospitals were places you went to die, run by monks with no medical training. They focused more on saving souls than saving lives. Patients lay 20 to a room in filthy straw beds, sharing infections while priests chanted prayers. The sickest were placed near altars so they could die in a holy atmosphere. There was no isolation, no clean linens, and definitely no hand-washing between patients. Mental illness treatment was especially cruel. Depression meant you had too much black bile, so doctors prescribed violent purges. Schizophrenia got you branded as a witch or possessed. The cure might involve drilling holes in your skull to let evil spirits escape, or chaining you in a dungeon until the demons left. Many spent their lives locked in madhouses where visitors paid to laugh at them like zoo animals. What passed for pain relief often made things worse. Herbal remedies included nightshade and henbane, plants we now know are poisonous. Doctors applied these to wounds or had patients inhale their smoke. The results included hallucinations, seizures, and sometimes death. Alcohol was the only real numbing agent, and patients had to drink themselves senseless before procedures. Diagnostic methods bordered on magical thinking. Doctors examined urine samples for color, smell, and sometimes taste. They believed that the stars influenced health, so treatments depended on astrological charts. The position of Jupiter might determine when to bleed you, while Mars dictated surgical timing. Even educated physicians consulted horoscopes before prescribing. Simple wounds became death sentences. Without antibiotics, a small cut could turn septic within days. Barbs from arrows or swords carried dirt deep into flesh. The standard treatment involved probing wounds with unsterilized fingers or tools, pushing bacteria deeper. Amputations happened when limbs turned black with gangrene, but few survived the shock and infection that followed. Eye diseases had particularly gruesome treatments. For cataracts, surgeons used a long needle to push the cloudy lens back into the eye. This blinded patients permanently, but was considered successful if they stopped complaining. Inflamed eyes might be treated with drops made from human breast milk or crushed beetles. Glaucoma patients had their temples cut open to release pressure. The Black Death brought out the worst in medieval medicine. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with protective herbs, unaware that fleas spread the plague. They prescribed bathing in vinegar or drinking molten gold. Some towns ordered citizens to whip themselves as penance, believing the plague was God's punishment. The treatments killed almost as many people as the disease itself. Medical education was laughably inadequate. Physicians trained by reading 500-year-old Greek texts full of errors. Anatomy lessons used drawings that bore no resemblance to actual human bodies. Human dissection was banned by the church. A doctor might graduate having never touched a patient, relying entirely on theories about invisible humors. Women's healthcare was especially dangerous. Male doctors never examined female patients directly. They diagnosed through intermediaries. A husband might describe his wife's symptoms while the doctor consulted an astrology chart. Pregnancy tests involved seeing if onions placed in the vagina made a woman's breath smell. Doctors believed menstrual blood could curdle wine and kill crops. Childhood illnesses often went untreated. Doctors believed children were just small adults, giving them the same brutal treatments. Fevers were cured with cold baths that sometimes induced fatal shock. Teething pain was treated by lancing the gums with dirty knives, leading to deadly infections. About half of all children died before age 5, often from medical neglect. The contrast with modern medicine couldn't be starker. We have anesthesia, sterile instruments, and evidence-based treatments. A simple infection that killed millions now clears up with a week of antibiotics. Medieval doctors would faint at the sight of an MRI machine or a laparoscopic surgery. What they called medicine, we'd call torture, and they inflicted it on people who had no other options. Despite all this, some medieval medical practices accidentally worked. Honey was used on wounds, unknowingly harnessing its antibacterial properties. Willow bark tea, which contains a compound similar to aspirin, eased pain. Midwives' herbal remedies sometimes contained real active ingredients. But for every lucky guess, there were 100 treatments that just made things worse. The worst part? People knew medicine wasn't working. They saw family members die after visiting doctors. They experienced the agony of pointless treatments. But with no alternative, they kept coming back, hoping this time might be different. Fear and desperation made them submit to horrors we can barely imagine today. Religion played an equally brutal role in daily life. The church didn't just control your soul. It dictated everything from what you ate to when you could have sex. The church bells didn't just mark time, they owned it. 3 times a day, the clanging ripped through your village, dragging you to your knees whether you were mid-plough or mid-meal. Skip prayer, and you weren't just lazy. You were courting eternal damnation. The church didn't suggest devotion. It demanded absolute obedience, weaving itself into every breath you took from birth to burial. Your entire calendar revolved around holy days, over 100 each year. These weren't vacations. They were mandatory mass attendances, fasting marathons, and public penance sessions. Work halted not for rest, but for ritual. Even weddings and funerals had to fit the church's schedule. The priest decided when you could marry, often forcing couples to wait through Advent or Lent. Your death rites depended on his approval too. Die unshriven, and your family paid extra to save your soul from limbo. Money flowed straight to the clergy, whether you could spare it or not. The tithe system took 10% of everything. Your harvest, your livestock, even the wool from your back. Refuse, and the church could deny you sacraments, effectively cutting you off from salvation. Worse, tithe collectors inspected your granary to ensure you didn't hold anything back. Your starvation mattered less than the bishop's new robe. The Bible might as well have been written in code. Since it existed only in Latin, you needed priests to interpret every passage. Sermons weren't discussions. They were warnings about hellfire tailored to keep you docile. Questioning scripture wasn't intellectual curiosity. It was heresy. Translations into common languages were forbidden, making the church the sole gatekeeper of divine truth. Your education, if you got any, came from monks teaching church doctrine. They drilled Latin prayers into children who didn't understand the words. Literacy existed purely to create more clergy. Peasants had no need for books beyond repeating catechisms. Knowledge outside church-approved texts was dangerous. Even noble families sent sons to monasteries just to learn reading, where they were steeped in religious propaganda. The ecclesiastical court system loomed over daily life. Priestly judges ruled on morality cases, missing Mass, working on saints' days, skipping confession. Punishments ranged from public whippings to pilgrimages that could take years. For serious offences like blasphemy, they handed you over to secular authorities for execution. The same courts tried cases of adultery, witchcraft, and heresy with brutal efficiency. Hospitality meant housing travelling clergy, whether you had space or food to spare. Any churchman, from a lowly friar to a bishop, could demand bed and board in your home. Refuse, and you risked excommunication. These uninvited guests often arrived with entourages, cleaning out your larder while lecturing you about gluttony. Festivals twisted into fear campaigns. Easter wasn't just celebration. It was mandatory communion where the priest checked who attended. Christmas involved eerie mystery plays depicting damnation. Harvest festivals became tithe collection events with priests eyeballing your yields. Every holiday blended obligation with intimidation. Marriage was a sacrament, but divorce didn't exist. Abusive unions lasted until death, with church courts intervening only to force coexistence. Women couldn't separate even from husbands who beat them daily. Annulments required bribes only nobles could afford. Your personal misery meant nothing against the church's need to control family structures. The Inquisition didn't just hunt heretics, it policed thoughts. Neighbors denounced each other for suspect behavior like avoiding pork, a sign of Jewish practice, or missing confession. Torture extracted confessions for offenses like owning the wrong book or doubting transubstantiation. A single accusation could destroy generations. Your property went to the church upon conviction. Death brought no escape from church control. Without last rites, you couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. The wealthy paid for perpetual masses to shorten their purgatory stays. Paupers' bodies were dumped in unconsecrated plots, where their souls were said to writhe forever. Even in death, your value was measured in coins to the clergy. Children weren't exempt from this machine. At 7, they could be held accountable for sins in confession. By 12, they faced full penalties for religious infractions. Many were placed in monasteries as child oblates. a lifetime of servitude disguised as devotion. Parental consent meant nothing when the church claimed divine right over souls. The church even regulated your sex life. Marital relations were forbidden during Lent, Advent, pregnancy, menstruation, and most saints' days, over half the year. Clergy interrogated couples about their bedroom habits during confession. Positions other than missionary could theoretically get you penance. Privacy didn't exist where souls were concerned. Agricultural methods stagnated under church doctrine. New farming tools were often rejected as disrupting God's natural order. Crop rotation patterns became ritualized rather than improved. When famine struck, the church called it divine punishment rather than poor planning. Entire villages starved while tithe barns overflowed. Scientific inquiry was heresy. Autopsies were banned, keeping medicine primitive. Astronomy was acceptable only for calculating Easter's date. The wealthy sometimes hired Arab physicians secretly, but any challenge to church-approved knowledge risked the stake. Progress didn't just stall, it marched backward under ecclesiastical oversight. Art served propaganda purposes. Church murals showed graphic hellscapes warning against disobedience. Wealthy donors paid for flattering portraits in stained glass, while peasants saw only damned souls in paintings. Creativity existed solely to reinforce doctrine. Any deviation meant the work was destroyed. Economic systems bent to church will. Charging interest was usury, a sin, forcing Jews into money-lending roles that made them targets. Markets couldn't operate near churches, disrupting trade. Craft guilds needed ecclesiastical approval, with members required to fund altars. Even commerce answered to the bishop. The Protestant Reformation didn't spring from nowhere. It grew from centuries of this suffocating control. When reformers finally translated the Bible into common languages, it wasn't just about theology. It was about breaking the church's monopoly on truth. The printing press did more damage to ecclesiastical power than any army could. Modern separation of church and state would have been unimaginable. Today's believers choose their level of devotion, attending services voluntarily, interpreting texts personally. Medieval peasants had no such luxury. Their religion wasn't faith. It was institutionalized terror wrapped in scripture. Yet for all its oppression, the church also provided order in chaotic times. Its courts settled disputes that might have sparked feuds. Its monasteries preserved fragments of knowledge. For many, the rhythm of prayers and sacraments offered comfort against the brutal uncertainty of medieval life. The system was corrupt, but alternatives were scarce. This control came at horrific cost. Millions lived and died without questioning their spiritual chains. The lucky few who did were usually silenced violently. Individual thought withered under centuries of enforced orthodoxy, leaving cultural scars that still linger in some traditions today. Women faced even tighter constraints under this system. Their bodies, labors, and souls were micromanaged by a male clergy preaching female subjugation. Your neighbor could beat his wife in the street, and no one would intervene. That wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Medieval life was soaked in violence from cradle to grave. The modern concept of domestic abuse didn't exist. A husband's right to correct his wife with physical punishment was written into law across Europe. Bruises were proof of proper household management, not crimes. Women who fought back often faced harsher penalties than their abusers for violating the natural order. Crime rates would make modern cities look peaceful by comparison. Without professional police forces, streets belonged to whoever was strongest. Drunken brawls spilled out of taverns nightly. Highwaymen lurked on rural roads. Even minor disputes often ended in stabbings. The average person expected to witness several violent deaths in their lifetime. Your chance of being murdered was about 10 times higher than in modern Western nations. Walking home after dark wasn't risky. It was practically suicidal. Justice systems created more violence than they prevented. Trials were brutal spectacles designed to entertain crowds as much as determine guilt. Violence isn't a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages, it is society. Courts favored dramatic punishments over fairness. A thief might lose a hand. A liar could have his tongue pierced. Blasphemers were branded on the forehead. These mutilations served as permanent warnings to others while ensuring the punished could never fully reintegrate into society. Public executions were weekly entertainment. Towns scheduled hangings on market days to draw bigger crowds. Nobles got beheadings with swords, a privilege that often took multiple clumsy swings. Heretics burned at the stake while spectators placed bets on how long they'd scream. Children attended these events like modern kids go to movies. The condemned were sometimes forced to perform comedy routines on the scaffold to please the audience before dying. Domestic violence was completely normal. Wives and children were considered property, not people with rights. Church teachings encouraged husbands to beat disobedient wives for their own good. Legal codes specified what size stick a man could use to discipline his family. Some towns allowed rods as thick as a thumb. Neighbors might intervene if a beating seemed excessive, but only because they worried about the man damaging his valuable property, not out of concern for the victim. Warfare was constant background noise. Someone was always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Professional armies didn't exist yet, so lords pressed peasants into service. You might get dragged into a battle over some noble's petty feud, handed a rusty spear, and told to charge armored knights. Survivors returned home traumatized, if they returned at all. Those who refused conscription faced execution as deserters. Trial by ordeal placed judgment in God's hands, which really meant leaving it to chance. An accused person might have to retrieve a stone from boiling water. 3 days later, if their burns showed signs of healing, they were innocent, otherwise guilty. Another method involved binding the suspect and throwing them in water. Floaters were witches, sinkers were innocent, but often drowned anyway. These tests weren't about truth. They were about providing divine justification for whatever punishment the community wanted. Street justice filled gaps where laws didn't reach. If someone stole your chicken, you didn't wait for authorities. You gathered relatives and attacked the thief's family. Blood feuds could last generations, with each death demanding another in retaliation. Local lords sometimes encouraged this. It kept peasants divided and easier to control. The concept of self-defense didn't exist. Violence was just how disputes got settled. Children learned violence early. Boys played with wooden swords, practicing for future battles. Girls learned that submission was their only protection. Corporal punishment in schools was universal. Students got whipped for mispronouncing Latin. Apprentices expected regular beatings from masters. By adulthood, most people viewed pain as an inevitable part of life, whether giving or receiving it. Nobles were the worst offenders. Their code of honor required violent responses to any perceived slight. 2 knights might start a deadly duel because one thought the other looked at him funny. Tournaments, glorified practice for war, regularly killed participants. Jousting accidents crushed ribs and shattered skulls. The wealthy essentially treated human lives as playthings, while peasants suffered the consequences. Prisons were temporary holding cells, not rehabilitation centres. You got thrown in a dungeon to await trial or punishment, not serve a sentence. Conditions were deliberately horrific. Dark, filthy holes where prisoners sat in their own waste. Jailers charged inmates for basic necessities like food and water. Those who couldn't pay often starved before their court date. Wealthy prisoners could buy better treatment, but peasants rotted in the dark. Witch hunts showed how quickly violence could spiral out of control. A bad harvest or sick cow might prompt accusations. Once someone was named, torture extracted confessions that implicated others. Whole villages turned on each other as neighbors sought scapegoats for their misfortunes. Children accused their own parents to avoid being targeted next. The frenzy only stopped when there was no one left to accuse. Violence shaped daily routines in subtle ways. You didn't travel alone. Doors had heavy locks if you could afford them. Farmers carried tools that could double as weapons. Parents warned children about strangers constantly. Every social interaction carried potential danger. Offend the wrong person, and you might not see tomorrow. People developed sharp situational awareness just to survive ordinary errands. Modern legal protections would seem like miracles to medieval people. Today, we have police who, theoretically, serve everyone, laws against domestic abuse, and courts that at least pretend to seek justice. Medieval peasants lived under systems where might made right, and the powerful faced no consequences. Our worst neighborhoods are safer than their average villages. The constant threat took a psychological toll. People lived with low-grade terror as a baseline condition. Some turned to alcohol to cope. Ale was cheaper than therapy. Others became numb to suffering, which explains the popularity of public executions as entertainment. A few turned the violence inward, becoming the monsters they feared just to feel some control. Ironically, all this bloodshed didn't actually make society more dangerous for the powerful. Lords used violence to maintain order among peasants, while exempting themselves from consequences. The threat of punishment kept most people obedient, even when starving. Brutality wasn't chaos. It was a tool for control, carefully applied to preserve the status quo. Modern life isn't perfectly peaceful, but the scale of difference is staggering. We complain about crime rates that would seem impossibly safe to medieval people. Our justice system, for all its flaws, at least pretends to value fairness over spectacle. Domestic violence laws exist even if enforcement is uneven. For all humanity's progress, perhaps the most underappreciated advance is how much less we expect to die violently today. Yet this constant brutality did more than just kill people. It kept lifespans shockingly short even for those who avoided murder or war. Between violence, disease, and malnutrition, making it to 40 was an accomplishment. Childhood was especially deadly. Parents had many children expecting to bury half of them. The average medieval person would find our modern concerns about retirement planning laughable when most never lived to see grey hair. Making it past childhood in the Middle Ages was like winning a lottery you didn't know you'd entered. Nearly half of all kids died before turning 5. If you survived that long, congratulations, you'd already beaten the odds. Your parents likely buried multiple siblings you never met. Infant mortality was so common that children weren't even named until they'd lived a year, just to avoid getting attached. The baby in the cradle next to yours might stop breathing overnight from a fever no one could explain. Parents expected to lose some of their kids like we expect to lose socks in the laundry. Childbirth was a death trap for both mother and baby. Women faced this danger as young as 14 or 15. No pain relief, no sterile tools, just a bed of straw and maybe a prayer. 1 in 3 women died giving birth. Those who survived often dealt with injuries that left them incontinent or sterile. Babies entered the world through a gauntlet of germs, with unwashed hands pulling them into life. Many newborns didn't make it past their first breath. Midwives kept a shovel by the door for the small bodies they'd need to bury before breakfast. Men didn't have it much safer. A simple cut while farming could turn deadly within days. Your plough hits a rock, the blade slips, and now you've got a gash that'll start oozing pus by nightfall. Without antibiotics, small wounds led to amputations or slow sepsis. Many men died from infected blisters after a long day's work. The fields were full of invisible threats: rusty tools, angry animals, collapsing equipment. You could be perfectly healthy at sunrise and dead by sundown from sheer bad luck. Disease swept through villages like a scythe through wheat. One person coughing in the market could doom half the town. Plagues weren't rare events. They came every few years, each time claiming a new generation. The sick were left to rot in their homes because no one understood contagion. You'd watch neighbors drop dead in the street, then dig their shallow graves with the same hands you used to eat your dinner. Medicine couldn't cure anything, so survival depended entirely on whether your body fought off the infection first. Famine was a constant shadow. A single bad harvest meant months of hunger. 2 bad years in a row, and people started eating bark and rats. Spoiled grain caused convulsions and screaming fits before killing you. The wealthy took their share first, leaving peasants to starve. Children's bellies swelled from malnutrition, while lords feasted in their castles. Many didn't die directly from starvation. They became so weak that a common cold could finish them off. Entire villages vanished during the worst famines, their empty huts reclaimed by the forest. Your body broke down fast. By 25, your back ached constantly from fieldwork. Missing teeth made chewing difficult. Old injuries from childhood never healed right, leaving you with a permanent limp. At 30, you were middle-aged. At 40, you were old. Most people didn't live to see grandchildren, if their kids survived long enough to have any. The idea of retirement didn't exist. You worked until you collapsed, then your children took over while you wasted away in the corner. Violence could claim you any time. A bar fight over a gambling debt, a run-in with bandits on the road, or just pissing off the wrong noble. Justice was arbitrary. You might hang for stealing bread, while a murderer walked free because he knew the right people. Wars drafted peasants as cannon fodder for lords' petty squabbles. Many men left for battle and never came home, their bodies rotting in some field no one would ever visit. Water was liquid danger. What looked like a clean stream carried dysentery and typhoid. Even clear well water might be tainted from the latrine dug upstream. Beer was safer, but constant low-grade alcoholism wrecked livers. Children drank the same weak ale because water could kill them faster. The wealthy weren't immune. Kings died from contaminated wine or spoiled feasts. Dehydration risked kidney failure, but drinking meant gambling with deadly microbes. Old age was brutal. No pensions, no nursing homes, just a corner of your child's hut if they could spare the space. Arthritis made every movement agony. Cataracts blinded you slowly. Without teeth, you gummed gruel while others ate proper meals. The cold seeped into your bones each winter, worsening coughs that never quite left. Many starved quietly when they could no longer work, their families barely surviving themselves. Death was casual, no fancy funerals, just a quick burial in unconsecrated ground if you died unshriven. Graves were shallow because diggers feared contagion. Your name faded fast, Most peasants left no records at all. The church gave sermons about you being in a better place, but really, everyone just hoped to avoid whatever killed you. Mourning periods were short because death was too common to dwell on. Compare this to modern lifespans. Today's 40-year-olds are in their prime, not decrepit. Vaccines protect kids from diseases that wiped out generations. Clean water flows from taps. Even our poorest live better than medieval nobility. The worst neighborhood today is safer than the nicest medieval village. Painkillers exist. Elders retire rather than starve. Modern medicine can fix problems that were death sentences just a century ago. The numbers don't capture the constant dread. Every cough could be your last. Every childbirth might kill your wife. Every winter could be the one that finishes you. People lived with death hovering at their shoulders, never knowing which season would be their final one. They prayed not for long life, but for a quick death when their time came. Yet they still found joy where they could, drank when possible, loved despite the risk of loss. Their resilience seems impossible to us now, coddled as we are by modern comforts. Maybe that's the most shocking part. Not how they died, but how they kept living under such bleak odds. The Middle Ages weren't romantic. They were centuries of relentless suffering with brief respites. That half-remembered golden age never existed. The truth is, you wouldn't have lasted a year in those conditions, let alone a full lifetime. Our most ordinary day would seem like a miracle to them. Their greatest comfort would be knowing future generations might have it easier. Let that sink in next time you complain about traffic or a slow Wi-Fi connection. Your worst day is still better than their best. The real dark ages weren't about lack of technology. They were about the sheer exhausting grind of trying to survive another year. We've traded that daily struggle for different problems. But never forget how thin the line between civilization and suffering really is. So that's the miserable truth about medieval life. No chivalry, no romance, just fleas, hunger, and an early grave. Modern life is a historical miracle they couldn't even dream of. Indoor plumbing, painkillers, food that won't kill you. We hit the jackpot without realizing it. Think about that next time you complain about slow internet. Your worst day beats their best year. Let me know in the comments which hardship shocked you most. The childbirth mortality, the non-stop labor, or the fact that their doctors were basically torturers. And take a moment to appreciate your mattress. It's basically a throne compared to what they had.